Hello everyone and welcome to Easy Beginner Houseplants. I'm Brooke, the owner of Outside In, and today I'm just going to walk you through what makes a plant easy or beginner. We'll dispel a few myths about plants and we'll go through some actual examples of houseplants that are easy. And we'll end with a few tips and tricks just to set you up for success with your plants. So jumping right in, what is an easy or beginner plant? So it's a very subjective term. So oftentimes you'll go into a plant shop or you're shopping for plants online and you see that label easy, low maintenance, sturdy, forgiving, hard to kill, beginner, something like that. So that is very subjective because basically all plants require some level of care, and there's a wide range of what beginner plants entail in terms of care and require. So what I recommend for an easy or beginner plant is, instead of you meeting a plant where it is and what it needs, is finding a plant that meets you at your needs. So what are your needs? What is your schedule like? How much time and effort do you want to put in to your plant care routine? So for example, we have something like a snake plant or a ZZ plant that requires very little care. You're maybe watering it once every month, once every 2 months. So if you're someone that travels a lot for work, or you just want to be a little less involved, and that's totally fine, then that is for you. So if, for example, you want to be more involved with your plant care, you may want to go for something more like a monstera. And we'll go through each of these plants individually, but just giving an example of how things can vary between different beginner plants. So this plant will typically want to be watered about once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks. So overwatering is typically the #1 killer of houseplants. So that's just something to also keep in mind when you're choosing a plant and how much effort you want to put in. So now I'm going to go over a few myths about houseplants that oftentimes lead beginner plant parents astray. So we're just going to dispel a few things. First is the myth of the green thumb. So it's not true that some people are just more gifted and born with the ability to care for plants. So all plant care comes down to two things, and that is light and water. Very basically, light and water. So a lot of times I'll hear people say, oh, I can't care for plants, I know nothing about plants. Really, everyone can take care of a plant as long as they're just placing it in the right location and having some type of awareness in terms of when to water and things like that. So the next myth is that there are very low light or no light plants. So when you see something marketed as low light and no light, chances are that plant does not thrive in those conditions, and there really is no light plant, because all plants need that vital source of sunlight in order to live and complete that process of photosynthesis. However, plants like the ZZ have been known to live for a few months in literally no light conditions, and they have survived but maybe not thrived. The third myth is that you should start out with a succulent. I never recommend a succulent for beginner plant parents, just because they can be so finicky when it comes to watering. So we know that they're drought tolerant and they store water, but as I said, overwatering is the #1 killer of most houseplants. So they're not very forgiving when you do overwater them, and they don't bounce back. They also require very high levels of light, and sometimes that includes direct sunlight. So a lot of spaces, if they have direct sunlight, it's only periodically throughout the day. And kind of weaving all of those myths together, sometimes you're just not set up for success with a plant like a succulent if the conditions aren't right. So like when I used to live in New York City in a tiny apartment with one window facing north, which north facing receives the least amount of light per day. I couldn't have owned a succulent just because right out of the gate, I'm not getting sufficient sunlight for that plant. So just knowing what your indoor environment looks like can really help with a plant. And again, finding a plant that meets you and your space at your needs. So now jumping into a few specific examples of what I consider easy and beginner plants. We'll start with this snake plant. So this is the Laurenti version. There are about 70 different varieties, so there's always going to be one that you'll find that you like with different coloring. So this is the Laurenti with that golden band around the edges, and as you can see, it has almost silver, light green foliage, as well as really dark green foliage. So this one's really beautiful, just combining a lot of different colors. There's also a fully silver one called the Moonshine, fully dark foliage. So this plant is, you may also know it as the mother-in-law's tongue or the bowstring hemp, and it's called bowstring hemp because in certain cultures, the fibers within the leaves were once used as literally bowstring, and they were also used to weave baskets and things like that. So this plant is, I consider, fairly easy to take care of. It requires bright, indirect light. So you'll see that a lot with houseplants, and I'm going to break down what that means. And basically almost all houseplants like bright, indirect light. So bright, indirect light means a sunny spot. Typically that's going to be an east or west facing window. South facing is going to usually have some morning or evening direct sun, and with the snake plant, that is fine to have it in any of those windows or near any of those windows. Indirect just means rays are not shining directly on the leaves. So when it comes to water, this plant's going to want to dry out between waterings almost completely. So I always say to check the soil to know when you need to water again, because the level of moisture that the soil retains throughout the year will vary. So what you can usually do is just slip that, you can wiggle a finger in there to check the soil, or just slip it out of the current pot and just do a little visual assessment. And you can see it's pretty light brown. It'll be very dark brown, almost black in certain portions when that soil is wet, basically. So that indicates that this plant is ready to be re-watered. And when you re-water any plant, you want to do so thoroughly. So that means allowing water to go all the way through. It touches all points of the soil and then trickles out of the bottom holes, which brings us to our next tip, which is one of the most important tips for a beginner or any plant parent, is your pot. And you always want either a pot with drainage, or if you have something like this one without drainage, then it's helpful to just keep the plant in that nursery grow pot that already has that drainage at the bottom, and just slip the plant out of the pot when it's time for watering. Go to the sink, water it, let it drain before putting it back. So anytime you have water sitting at the bottom of the pot, that's just not going to be a good condition for the plant, because that easily leads to root rot and eventual demise of the plant. And this plant is really great because it grows new shoots, which we call pups, which can just be separated off of that mother plant, and we can plant it up into a new pot, and it's a totally new, fresh plant. So this one's also great because it releases oxygen at night, whereas other plants release oxygen just during the day. So a lot of people, like me, like to have this one in the bedroom because some people believe that it just aids sleep a little bit more with that extra boost of oxygen in the air. So next we're going to move on to the ZZ plant, which is my favorite plant for gifting, whether it's a housewarming or a host gift, any kind of gift, just because this plant is great for everyone from beginners to more advanced plant parents. It's a little less common than the snake plant. It's still a fairly common plant, but less common than the snake plant. And it just can thrive in almost any condition. So this is the plant that actually can live in low light, but it will thrive with that brighter light, that bright indirect light or moderate level of light. And it is also going to want to dry out almost completely between waterings. So this plant is native to kind of desert regions where it's warm and arid. So it does store water within the tubers beneath the soil. So you're going to want to make sure that you don't overwater this one. That's basically the only issue that you're going to see. This plant is very pest resistant. It's just a good all-around plant. So moving on now to the monstera. So this is a vining plant. This is the monstera. You may also know the Monstera deliciosa, which is that big, like bushier version that's really popular on social media, Instagram, Pinterest, that really has that tropical feel. This is basically another type of monstera that we refer to as the Swiss cheese plant, and you can see why with these beautiful holes in the leaves that resemble Swiss cheese. So this plant is believed to have adapted to get this trait of the holes in the leaves because it is native to more tropical rainforest regions. So it's believed that when coastal winds come through, they can just flow through these holes easily without breaking the plant leaves apart. So that's just a cool little fact about this plant. And since this is a vining plant, you can let it cascade down, or for really huge, magnificent leaves, you can place some type of stake like a moss pole in the plant in the soil and allow the aerial roots to attach onto the moss pole and climb upwards to eventually have that really huge growth. So that's how the plant grows in the wild, and that's really preferable, but it really doesn't matter, whichever version you like better, whether you like it trailing down or reaching up. So this plant also likes moderate to bright indirect levels of light. As far as water, you'll want the soil to dry out about 1 to 2 inches down the soil. So kind of wiggle a finger in and see if that soil is dry or almost dry, and then water again. So moving on now to this plant. So a lot of go-to beginner plant is the pothos. So while this plant is marketed as and called the silver satin pothos, it is actually of the Scindapsus genus. So this is the Scindapsus pictus exotica. And this plant is just really unique because it's a little more uncommon to find, and it has these brilliant leaves with that silver foliage. Again, they kind of start to shimmer in like the morning or evening sunlight. And this is another one that is my go-to for gifting just because it's gorgeous. It rarely has any issues. It rarely has pests. It's flexible. It can bounce back very easily. And it's also a vining plant with aerial roots, which means you can allow it to trail down, or again, place a plant stake in there for it to grow larger. And you can see since this is trailing down, the leaves are a little bit smaller. So if you allow it to vine, it'll get leaves more like this one that are really a lot larger. So with this one, you'll want it to dry out again partially. And this one is actually pretty light right now. And that's something that kind of comes with experience with plants, is knowing if it feels light or heavy. So since it feels light, I know it needs to be watered. I also know it needs to be watered because the leaves are starting to curl in, which is unique to this plant. And when I go to rewater this one, I want to check that it's dried out almost halfway down the soil, and again, water very thoroughly. And this plant likes bright indirect light. Again, it can tolerate lower levels. I have this one in my room as well, which is really dark, and it is surviving, but I would say not thriving. So it's staying as it is, kind of stunted and not putting out new leaves. So last is our Peperomia, which is also called a baby rubber plant, and the leaves, the texture is kind of rubbery, it's kind of waxy, the leaves are a little thicker, so it's almost succulent-like, and this plant is really great for beginners, but I will say out of these 5 plants, it is not really as forgiving when you overwater. So really try not to overwater, allow it to dry out at least halfway down the soil between waterings. And it's also going to be a little more finicky when it comes to sunlight. So when this one's in lower levels of light, it's not going to be happy. So this plant likes bright indirect light, and it actually sometimes can tolerate and enjoys some direct light, like morning or evening direct light. So that would be a south-facing window. Just preparing you now with a few last tips for these beginner plants is we already went over the drainage. Make sure that you have a drainage hole in your pots, or that you're just slipping the plants back into a pot still in its original container. Make sure that you have the location correct for your plant, like meaning in your home, that you're placing it in the most optimal space for the plant to thrive. Next is yellowing leaves. So I get a lot of questions about yellowing or brown crispy leaves. So if it's just one on your plant, that's normal and actually healthy. So as new growth comes in and we have to make room, the plant basically has to make room for that new growth. A lot of times the old leaves will start to expire. So just know that that's normal, unless it's a lot of leaves changing colors that could indicate an issue. But if it's just one or two, just know that that is normal and that is fine. And then overpotting. So that's another issue. A lot of times people bring a plant home, or they get a plant in the mail and they want to repot it immediately. So when a plant is adjusting to a new space, it's going to need about 4 to 6 weeks, just because it could be a little bit stressed from moving locations. So during those 4 to 6 weeks, you only want to provide light and water. No fertilizing, no repotting, no propagating, just the basics of light and water. Try your best not to repot unless you have a real reason for repotting. So a lot of times houseplants only need to be repotted every 1 to 2 years. So make sure that if you are repotting, you have a really good reason to do so, because that can stress the plant. There is something called transplant shock that can occur and leads to a lot of issues that I see with houseplants. And last is fertilizing. All houseplants do need some type of fertilizer, just some type of granular houseplant fertilizer is usually suitable. But how much and how frequently will depend on the specific plant. So you'll have to look that up, but just know that you do need to fertilize, especially during the active growing season, which is usually the months during summer and spring. So I do have these beautiful spring pots that we sell on outsideinco.com. We sell all of these plants as well, so please check if you like any. I'll drop the link below. So that is everything about beginner plants. I hope you learned something. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments below and I'll be sure to get back to you. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more videos like this. Thank you.